Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
This is the story of how a perfect vacation turned into the longest nightmare in the criminal history of modern Brazil. On October 12, 2010, 5 American tourists disappeared without a trace into the green hell of the Amazon forest. Julie Gordon, Angela Carson, William White, John Ball, and Brian Blake went on a hike to the waterfalls and never returned. For 7 years, their families lived in agonizing suspense, believing them dead, consumed by the wild. Until one day, a police raid, hundreds of miles away from where they disappeared, discovered a plastic container in a forest camp. Inside were fresh photos of the missing Americans. They were alive, emaciated, and locked in concrete walls. But in each picture, their eyes were cut perfectly straight with a surgical blade right on the photo paper. Gaping black holes instead of faces looked directly into the camera lens. On October 10, 2010, the international airport of the Brazilian city of Manaus greeted a group of 5 American tourists with stifling air. The thermometer that morning read 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was approaching a critical 90%. It was a vacation that the group of friends had been carefully planning for over 8 months. 30-year-old Julie Gordon, 31-year-old Angela Carson, 33-year-old William White, 29-year-old John Ball, and 33-year-old Brian Blake had flown here to explore the wild, untouched Amazon forest. Immediately after passing through customs, the group headed to the car rental center, where a pre-booked silver Toyota Highlander 4-wheel drive SUV was waiting for them. After loading their massive hiking backpacks, tents, and camping equipment, the Americans drove out onto the federal highway BR 174. This highway, cutting through an endless green wall of jungle, led directly north. According to the police investigation, on October 12th, at 10:15 in the morning, the SUV made a short stop. It was a large gas station of the Posto Ecuador network, located several dozen miles from the city limits. Surveillance footage recovered by investigators later became the last documentary evidence that all 5 were alive. The low-resolution black and white footage clearly shows William White walking up to the cash register and paying cash for a full tank of gas. At the same time, camera number 4, installed inside the convenience store, captured Julie Gordon. The woman purchased a detailed topographic map of the area and 3 large bottles of strong mosquito repellent. In the video, the friends look relaxed, laughing and discussing something by the open car door. At 10:32, the Toyota Hilux left the gas station and disappeared into the haze of hot asphalt. Their final destination was the municipality of Presidente Figueiredo, a region famous among tourists for its cascading waterfalls, deep gorges, and extremely dense forests. At 13 hours and 40 minutes that afternoon, the group parked their SUV in a dirt parking lot near the start of a hiking trail that led to the massive Caverna do Maruaga cave system. National park regulations required all visitors to register. In the worn logbook of the ranger on duty, there was an entry made in Brian Blake's hand at 13 hours and 45 minutes. The entry indicated that the group was planning a 3-day hike deep into the jungle. The most important detail of this recording was that the Americans mentioned the presence of a guide. However, they hired a local guide unofficially, bypassing travel agencies, so his name and contact information were not recorded in the log. On October 15th, the day the group was supposed to return to their car and report to the post, none of them showed up. On October 19th, at 8 in the morning, a patrol ranger noticed that the Toyota Hilux was still in its place, thickly covered with a layer of dust and fallen leaves. The doors were locked, and only empty plastic bottles and tourist brochures were visible through the glass. All attempts to contact the tourists via their cell phones proved futile, as the devices were out of cellular coverage. That same evening, local police officially declared the 5 United States citizens missing. The next morning, a search and rescue operation of unprecedented scale was launched. Regular units of the Brazilian Army, special rescue teams, and dozens of local volunteers were involved. The search area was divided into square sectors, with a total area of more than 400 square miles. Military helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imagers circled the impenetrable tree canopy for days on end, trying to catch the slightest heat radiation from human bodies or fires. On the ground, dozens of dog handlers with trained dogs combed the banks of the nearest river tributaries meter by meter, wading through thorny bushes. The conditions were hellish. Temperatures reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and the incredible humidity made it difficult to breathe even for the locals. Days passed, but the green maze did not give up its prisoners. It was only on November 2nd, more than 2 weeks after the search began, that the operation yielded the first and only clue. 4.5 miles northeast of the parked vehicle, on the muddy bank of a narrow, unnamed tributary, one of the rescuers spotted a piece of cloth. It turned out to be a tourist backpack. Investigators quickly identified it as belonging to John Ball by the serial number on the tag. The backpack was badly torn, the fabric was torn, and most of the pockets were open. However, the most surprising thing was that forensic experts did not find a single drop of blood on it. There were no signs of a struggle, no shoe prints, and no signs of wild animal attack around the discovery. The backpack looked as if it had been thrown off his shoulders in a panic and simply left lying in the mud. No other belongings, clothing, or equipment were found. The dogs lost the trail literally a few dozen feet from the water. It seemed as if 5 adults had simply vanished into the heavy air of the rainforest, leaving not even a shadow behind. On December 17, 2010, when the hope of finding the tourists alive had finally faded and there were no more resources left to continue the operation, the active search was officially curtailed. Thick folders of police reports were sent to the archive, and the status of the investigation was changed to an unsolved case. The families of the disappeared were left face to face with the painful unknown, convinced that the jungle had swallowed their loved ones forever. None of them could even imagine that the real horror had nothing to do with wildlife, and that the worst ordeal had just begun somewhere in the deafening, suffocating darkness. Exactly 7 long years have passed since that fateful day when the green maze of the Amazon swallowed up 5 American tourists without a trace. For their families, this time has turned into an endless agony of waiting. But the world has moved on. Not a single living soul hoped for a miracle or even a logical explanation for the tragedy. However, on November 14, 2017, the course of this hopeless case changed dramatically. The epicenter of the events was hundreds of miles away from the original place of disappearance, in an incredibly remote jungle near the Rio Hatapu riverbed. On that gloomy morning, the Brazilian Federal Police were conducting a large-scale and brutal operation. The main target of the raid was a well-camouflaged camp of illegal loggers and gold miners. At 4 o'clock, 15 minutes in the morning, an elite tactical team, using the thick morning fog and tropical rainstorm as cover, began to surround the perimeter. The humidity reached 98%, and the mud under their army boots instantly turned into a viscous glue. When the first orders to surrender came over the police loudspeakers, the criminals ran for their lives. Most of the illegal immigrants disappeared into the dense thickets of a giant fern. At 5 o'clock, 40 minutes in the morning, the police had gained a firm foothold in the camp. After establishing control of the perimeter, the commander of the Special Forces Unit, Captain Tiago, ordered a methodical search of the dirty wooden buildings. The camp consisted of 24 primitive shacks covered with rusty metal. The air was filled with the heavy stench of spilled diesel fuel and sour sweat. At 6:30 in the morning, the captain's attention was drawn to the most fortified structure. Local informants called this building Armazém de Ferro, which meant iron warehouse. The entrance to the warehouse was blocked by a massive steel door, which the operatives had to break down with a tactical battering ram. Inside, the room was dim, littered with rusty tools and barrels of oil. Moving deeper into the warehouse, the beam of a police flashlight snatched a heavy metal safe from the semi-darkness, which was firmly embedded in the concrete floor. Its door had been crudely broken and pried open by the criminals themselves, who were panicking and trying to take the most valuable items. The captain walked closer, expecting to see bars of dirty gold or briquettes of drugs. Instead, he felt something completely different and unexpected. At 7 hours and 15 minutes in the morning, the captain pulled out a sealed plastic container, carefully wrapped in electrical tape. Cutting the tape with a knife blade, he carefully opened the lid. Inside the container was an old film camera and a stack of printed color photographs. In total, there were several dozen 5x7-inch pictures. Wearing sterile gloves so as not to destroy the evidence, Tiago began to look through the find. These weren't just pictures. They were a documented chronicle of prolonged, inhuman horror. The glossy paper showed people in an absolutely catastrophic physical condition. They looked emaciated to the point of exhaustion, their skin covered with a layer of stale dirt. All of them were tightly tied with thick belts to heavy metal chairs. The backdrop for each scene was a depressing, dimly lit concrete room with no hint of windows. Looking at the haggard faces, the captain shuddered. Despite the men's long, tangled hair and thick beards that had distorted their features beyond recognition, he recognized them. 7 years ago, these same faces had stared back at him from the lineups at every police station in the state. They were Julie, Angela, William, John, and Brian. The photographs showed unmistakably that they were taken long after the tourists had officially disappeared. Years of imprisonment had left a terrible mark on their bodies. But the worst part was another absolutely insane detail that turned this evidence into a nightmare. In absolutely every photo, all 5 prisoners had their eyes carefully, with manic surgical precision, cut out right on the photo paper. Someone had methodically removed these fragments with a sharp scalpel. The gaping black holes in place of the faces stared silently directly at the police, creating an effect of paralyzing panic, and hiding a secret that turned out to be much darker than anyone could have imagined. Dear viewers, before we dive into the darkest details of this investigation, I have a small but extremely important request for you. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below this video, and be sure to like it. Your activity is not just a nice bonus, but a critical tool. It is thanks to your likes and comments that the YouTube platform algorithms realize that this content is worthy of attention and begin to actively promote it in recommendations. Thus, many more people will be able to watch this complex documentary story. I am sincerely grateful to each of you for your continued support of my work. Now let's get back to the criminal case file. On November 17, 2017, the Office of the Federal Prosecutor of the State of Amazonas issued an urgent order to officially reopen the investigation into the disappearance of 5 American citizens. All 52 gruesome photographs discovered during the raid were immediately packed in sterile vacuum bags to preserve the slightest microscopic trace. The same morning, the evidence was shipped by special government flight to the main forensic laboratory in Brasilia. A team of the country's best forensic experts worked on the images almost around the clock. The spectral analysis of the glossy photo paper, as well as a detailed study of the chemical degradation of the colored ink, allowed the forensic experts to draw an absolutely conclusive conclusion. According to the extended laboratory report of November 21st, these images were taken and printed between 2011 and 2013. This fact radically changed the whole picture of the case. The American tourists did not fall victim to an attack by wild predators or a fatal accident in the first days of their trek. They remained alive for at least 3 long years after they were officially reported missing. 3 years in conditions of absolute isolation and hopelessness. Since the victims in the photographs themselves were obviously unable to give any testimony or point to the exact place of their imprisonment, detectives focused all their analytical power on the only available evidence: the background of the photographs. Thanks to multiple digital enhancements of the images, the forensic experts were able to extract small details of the interior from the semi-darkness. Analysts paid special attention to the unique brickwork of the walls. It was an old red hand-molded brick, firmly bonded with a thick layer of a specific lime mortar. In addition, several photographs showed massive cast iron pipes covered with a layer of old rust in the corners of the room, with characteristic riveted connections on the flanges. On November 22nd, a leading expert in historical industrial architecture was brought in to investigate. After carefully studying the enlarged fragments of the photographs, the expert gave a definite answer. Such deep basements with a complex system of thick ventilation pipes were built in South America exclusively at the very beginning of the 20th century. They belonged to the era of the Great Rubber Fever and were used by wealthy planters as giant natural refrigerators. These thick-walled underground bunkers were used to store the collected sap of the hevea tree so that it would retain its properties and not deteriorate in the infernal tropical heat on the surface. With this clear search vector, the team of investigators literally plunged into the dusty archives of the state's real estate registries. Their daunting task was to locate absolutely every old rubber plantation that had documented basements and was located within a radius of at least 100 miles of the initial disappearance of the tourist group near the caves. The review of thousands of yellowed pages of cadastral plans and tax returns took a full week, requiring incredible meticulousness. On November 28th, the computer database finally produced a single, perfect match. The detective's attention was immediately drawn to a huge and completely isolated estate called Casarán das Aguas Negras, which meant House of Black Waters. This plot of land, with an area of more than 4,000 acres, was located on a remote, extremely inaccessible peninsula. On 3 sides, the estate was securely surrounded by impassable, mosquito-infested swamps and extremely deep river channels. It was physically impossible to get there by land. It was just the perfect place to hide anything or anyone for a long time. But the most frightening thing about this discovery was not the place itself, but the name of its rightful owner. According to notarized documents, in 2004, a citizen named Hector Silva bought the entire complex. The detectives immediately pulled up his extended file in the federal database, and what they saw there made even hardened police officers shudder in horror. Hector Silva was 58 years old at the time. In the past, he was considered an incredibly talented ophthalmologist and ambitious researcher who worked in one of the most prestigious private clinics in a large city. However, in the early 2000s, his successful career came to an abrupt end. A special medical commission with a loud scandal permanently deprived Silva of his medical license. The multi-page materials of the disciplinary case stated that the doctor had conducted illegal and completely unethical experiments on his own patients. The man was morbidly obsessed with fringe scientific theories about the visual perception of the human brain and the effects of long-term sensory deprivation on the psyche. In that tense moment, all the disparate pieces of a complex criminal puzzle finally came together in one monolithic, pitch-black picture. A huge remote estate with deep historical cellars. A former ophthalmologist obsessed with illegal experiments. And 52 fresh photos of the missing tourists, in which each and every captive had jeweled eyes.
Law enforcement finally realized what kind of monster they were dealing with.
The command of the tactical units began to urgently prepare a plan for a night assault by water, not even realizing what concentrated evil awaited them in the pitch black of the dungeon. Having received indisputable evidence in the form of photographs, and having established the exact location of the Casarão das Águas Negras estate, the leadership of the Brazilian Federal Police immediately began preparations for the assault. Given the high level of danger and the likelihood that the suspect, Hector Silva, could be heavily armed or have dangerous accomplices, the operation was entrusted to the elite tactical unit Comando de Operaciones Táticas. The analysts carefully studied satellite images of the peninsula and came to a completely disappointing conclusion. It was almost impossible to approach the building on the ground. On 3 sides, the vast territory of the estate was densely surrounded by deep mangrove swamps and impenetrable forest thickets, which turned the place into an ideal natural fortress. The only viable and least risky option was a surprise night assault by water. The start of the operation was scheduled for December 2, 2017. At 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 heavy armored boats of the tactical group set sail from a temporary police base located 15 miles downriver. 24 hardened operatives were on board, equipped with heavy armor and night vision devices. To avoid premature detection, the boats moved with their running lights completely off, and their powerful engines were equipped with special noise suppression systems. They glided silently through the black, tar-like waters of the river tributary. Around them was thick, pitch-black darkness, broken only by the cries of night birds and the dull splash of water under the steel sides.
The air was heavy, hot, and saturated with moisture, making it difficult to breathe even through tactical masks. At 2:45 in the morning, the boats approached the estate's shoreline to within 500 feet and turned off their engines. In absolute silence, the soldiers descended into the muddy water, which in some places reached their chests, and extremely slowly made their way to the shore, instantly dispersing around the perimeter of the territory. Through the greenish lenses of the thermal imaging scopes, the vast territory looked absolutely dead. Not a single camera detected the slightest source of heat or the slightest movement within 1,000 feet. Up close, the Casarão das Águas Negras estate made an extremely depressing impression and looked more like a set for an old horror movie than the upscale home of a wealthy ophthalmologist. The huge 2-story building was ruthlessly deteriorating under the constant pressure of the aggressive tropical climate. The wide wooden verandas had long since rotted away and partially collapsed inward. The facade was densely covered with a thick layer of gray moss, and the spacious courtyard was almost completely absorbed by wild jungle vegetation. All the windows on the first floor were tightly boarded up with thick boards. The commander of the assault team gave a silent signal with his hand, and at exactly 3 in the morning,
the special forces simultaneously knocked down the massive front door and the back entrance, penetrating the mansion with lightning speed. The first and second floors greeted the armed police with absolute emptiness and a thick layer of years of dust covering the antique furniture. It was obvious that no one had set foot here for years. There were no traces of residents, no hints of the presence of Hector Silva or his unfortunate captives. However, the experienced operatives knew exactly what they were looking for.
The attention of one of the snipers providing external cover was drawn to a strange metal object hidden in the dense shrubbery, 150 feet from the main building. It turned out to be a massive industrial diesel generator of the latest model. From it, a thick armored power cable stretched across the damp ground, entering directly under the stone foundation of the house. Following the route of this cable inside the building, the sappers found themselves in the spacious former office of the owner on the first floor. The cable brazenly disappeared into the brick wall just behind a giant oak bookcase that looked like it had been firmly nailed to the floor. 3 strong men, using special steel crowbars, pulled the heavy bookcase aside with incredible effort, kicking up clouds of dry dust. A massive steel door panel was hiding behind it, perfectly embedded in the historic brickwork. Its modern appearance was completely at odds with the decaying, rotting appearance of the entire surrounding estate. It was a heavy, hermetically sealed door, equipped with an extremely sophisticated electronic locking system with a code keypad. It was direct, indisputable proof that something technological and vital to the owner was functioning deep underground. Without wasting precious minutes on futile attempts to find the right digital password, the chief explosives expert quickly fixed a directed action cumulative charge on the lock panel. The soldiers retreated to a safe hiding place outside the office. At 3 o'clock, 12 minutes in the morning, a dull but incredibly powerful explosion occurred. The thick steel bent inward, the internal mechanisms of the lock shattered into small pieces, and the door opened with a loud screech. An icy jet of dead, stagnant air instantly hit the operatives in the face from the open black hole. A narrow concrete staircase led steeply downward, going about 50 feet underground. The soldiers simultaneously turned on their tactical flashlights and, holding their weapons tightly at the ready, began their slow, cautious descent into the unknown. With each step down, the temperature dropped significantly, and breathing became more and more difficult due to the lack of oxygen. The air here was literally saturated with a heavy, nauseating smell of specific chemical medicines, old basement mold, long unwashed human bodies, and something indistinctly sweet, a concentrated smell of decay and death. It was a specific stench that detectives who had been working on serious crimes for years could not confuse with any other smell on earth. Going down to the very end of the concrete staircase, the tactical team found themselves at the beginning of a long, eerie underground corridor. The walls here were lined with the same historic red brick that the forensic experts had previously identified in photographs. Massive, rusty cast-iron pipes of the ancient ventilation system stretched under the low, vaulted ceiling, humming with the work of hidden motors. This endless corridor was lit only by a few dim lamps covered with thick red glass. This dim, bloody light created a persistent psychological illusion that the police officers had physically descended into the very depths of hell, devoid of any hope. On both sides of this nightmarish tunnel were heavy metal doors with small external bolts, which finally turned the former rubber storage facility into a real, secret, high-security prison. The absolute dead silence pressed unbearably on my eardrums, making my heart beat faster. The commander of the assault team gestured with a tense gesture to the 2 men in the first line
to approach the first massive door on the right. One of the policemen took a deep breath and gently placed his tactical gloved hand on the cold metal of the bolt, preparing to throw it open, not even realizing what unspeakable horror was hiding on the other side of the thick steel. The atmosphere in the mansion's underground corridor was so thick and paralyzing that the operatives felt as if they could physically feel the weight of the dead air. The commander of the SOT tactical group gestured to his men to divide into twos and begin methodically opening the cells. At 3:20 in the morning, 2 commandos approached the first massive door on the left side of the tunnel. One of them tightly gripped the steel bolt and threw it violently to the side. When the door opened with a heavy jerk, the beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the darkness of a room about 80 square feet in size. The inside was completely empty. However, what the police saw on the walls made their hearts clench in horror. The thick layer of old brick was covered with random, deep scratches. Forensic experts would later confirm that these were human fingernail marks. Someone had spent hours, days, or even months in mad desperation trying to tear through the wall with their bare hands, leaving deep furrows in the stone. Cell number 2 and cell number 3 greeted the police with the same dead silence. They also turned out to be empty, retaining only the persistent, nauseating stench of stale sweat and decay. It seemed that the hope of finding anyone alive was finally fading with each door that was opened. The soldiers moved on, clutching their assault rifles tightly, until they found themselves at the very end of a red-lit corridor. This was the last cell. Unlike the previous ones, its doors were additionally covered with a thick layer of rubber for absolute soundproofing. No sound could penetrate inside, and no scream could escape. The lock clicked loudly. When the soldiers pulled the heavy door open with incredible effort, they were met with pitch-black, thick darkness. The light bulb under the ceiling was deliberately unscrewed. The squad leader stepped forward and directed the blinding white beam of his 2,000-lumen flashlight deep into the cell. At the same moment, a piercing, inhuman scream came from the far corner, echoing off the concrete walls of the dungeon. The light snatched a human figure out of the darkness. The person cowered in the corner, instinctively curled up in a ball and panicked, covering his face with his dirty, bony hands. She was screaming frantically, begging for the lights to be turned off, her body shaking with incredible shock. It was a woman. Despite her catastrophic emaciation, dirty gray skin, and completely gray, tangled hair, the commander instantly recognized her from old police descriptions. It was Julie Gordon. The woman who had gone on the vacation of her dreams was now 37 years old, though physically she looked her full 60. Her body was exhausted to the point of exhaustion, but she was alive and had no visible fatal injuries. The medics of the tactical team rushed to her, immediately turning off the bright lights and switching to dim chemical lighting. They carefully placed a thick black bandage over Julie's eyes to protect her atrophied pupils from irreversible damage and administered a strong dose of a sedative. At the same time, the second team kicked in the door to an adjoining room, where the soft hum of an exhaust fan could be heard. It was a large room, converted into a professional photo lab. In the middle of the room, under the light of a red lamp, 58-year-old Hector Silva was sitting at a table. The picture of his detention shocked the experienced officers with its routine. According to Sergeant Costa's official report, the suspect did not even flinch when the heavily armed men in black burst into the room. He did not try to escape or resist. Silva only slowly looked up from the table, where he was calmly sorting through fresh photographic negatives with metal tweezers. The man put down the tool in absolute cold blood and silently stretched his arms forward, allowing the police to put heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists. His face expressed neither fear nor remorse,
only mild irritation at being interrupted during his important work. By morning, the estate had turned into a giant crime scene. Federal police investigators began a large-scale search of the area. During a thorough inspection of Silva's office, detectives found a folded topographic map with barely visible crosses. Using these coordinates, the canine service and the forensic team headed west of the house. After walking through the dense jungle for about 3 miles, they came to an old, long-abandoned stone quarry that was listed in municipal records as Pedrera de São José. The sun had already risen high, heating the air to an unbearable 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At 11:30 in the morning, the sniffer dogs began barking loudly, pointing to a patch of hard ground thickly covered with gravel and dry branches. The forensic team began a cautious excavation. After a few hours of grueling work, human bones emerged from the ground. Experts discovered 4 separate, unmarked graves. These were the remains of Angela Carson, William White, John Ball, and Brian Blake. Their 7 years of obscurity finally came to an end at the bottom of a dead quarry, thousands of miles from their homes. The capture operation was over. The monster was sitting in an armored van, and the remains of the victims were carefully packed for transportation. But as the medical helicopter took to the air, carrying Julie Gordon to the nearest hospital, the detectives accompanying her felt only a clammy, cold fear. The woman lying on the stretcher continued to moan softly, incessantly, even through her medically induced sleep. They realized that the concrete prison had been destroyed. But the worst part of this investigation was just beginning. None of the police officers had any idea what horrors were hiding in that absolute darkness, or what horrific truth would come out when the only survivor finally spoke. An evacuation medical helicopter brought the rescued woman to the federal hospital in Manaus in the early morning. The clinic's territory was immediately cordoned off, and armed guards were posted at the door of the intensive care unit around the clock. Doctors diagnosed 37-year-old Julie Gordon with critical physical exhaustion, severe muscle atrophy, and a catastrophic vitamin D deficiency. Julie was panicked and screaming, afraid of any light source. At her categorical demand, all the windows in the ward were covered with a thick, light-proof film, and the medical staff moved only in the twilight, using dim pocket flashlights with red filters. It was only after many weeks of intensive drug therapy and daily work with crisis psychologists that she was able to utter her first coherent phrases. On January 9, 2018, the lead investigators in the case first crossed the threshold of her darkened room. The conversation was recorded on an old cassette recorder, as even the dim LED of a modern digital device caused the survivor to have severe panic attacks. What the detectives heard that day forever changed their understanding of the limits of human cruelty. Julie Gordon's confession restored the chronology of the fall into the abyss step by step, answering the main question: how exactly did 5 healthy, cautious tourists end up in the concrete captivity of a maniac? According to the dry lines of the protocol, the fatal mistake occurred at the beginning of the hiking trail in October 2010. The local guide, whom the group had hired unofficially, wanting to see the caves hidden from the mass tourist, turned out to be Hector Silva's secret accomplice. The man, whose face Julie still saw in her nightmares, confidently led them around the main routes, taking them deeper into the stifling, wild jungle. At one of the halts, when the temperature exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the guide kindly offered the exhausted Americans water from his bulky metal canteens. The water had a subtle bitter taste. This was the last thing Julie remembered before the ground abruptly left her feet and her consciousness fell into a thick, sticky veil. They woke up not on the damp ground of the rainforest, but on an icy concrete floor. The air was saturated with the heavy smell of stale dampness and medicines. All 5 of them were tied tightly with thick leather straps to heavy metal chairs. When the massive steel door opened with a grinding sound, Hector Silva appeared on the threshold. Julie told the detectives in a hoarse, trembling voice that this man did not look like a typical criminal or kidnapper. He didn't threaten them with death, demand huge ransoms from their families, or show signs of classic sadism. Instead, he walked in front of them in a neat, faded medical coat and spent hours delivering insane, frighteningly calm lectures. Silva methodically explained to his captives that human vision is an evolutionary dead end. He sincerely and fanatically believed that visual noise overloaded the brain, blocking its hidden resources and preventing, as he put it, the true perception of the universe. He did not call them victims, but selected participants in a great scientific experiment of total sensory deprivation. After finishing his first speech, the former ophthalmologist turned off the lights and walked out, leaving them in absolute impenetrable blackness. The years merged into one endless, torturous night. The darkness became their main executioner, driving them crazy more reliably than any sophisticated physical torture. Only once in several long months did Silva break this darkness. He would enter the cell, rigidly fix their heads with metal brackets, and suddenly turn on a blindingly bright, unbearably painful light with a power of several thousand watts. This light cut their unused eyes like broken glass. Silva coldly photographed their faces, distorted in agony and blind panic. The eyes cut out in the prints that the police would find in the jungle years later were his sick, twisted symbol that he had cut off their connection to the visual world forever. Julie's friends could not survive this basement hell. John Ball was the first to surrender, about 1.5 years after the abduction. The isolation and the maddening darkness completely destroyed his psyche. He stopped responding to the voices of his friends, refused to accept the scanty food brought by his captor, and quietly died of exhaustion. He was followed by Angela Carson, Brian Blake, and William White, who could not withstand the psychological torture and the diseases that developed against the background of extreme unsanitary conditions. Every time one of them took his last breath in the darkness, Silva came and silently carried away the cold body. The investigator sitting at Julie's bedside quietly asked how she alone had managed to keep her sanity and survive for 7 long years. The woman was silent for a long time, looking into the emptiness of the darkened room. Then she answered that she had learned to count seconds maniacally. 86,400 seconds in a single day. In order not to dissolve in the darkness, she closed her eyes and built a detailed map of her hometown in her head from memory. She walked the streets of Seattle in her mind, recalling the color of each house, the cracks in the asphalt, the signs of tiny shops. She created a crime-free fictional world inside herself, where the monster with the scalpel had no access. The interrogation lasted more than 4 hours. The detectives were about to turn off the recorder, believing that the crime scene was completely clear and Silva's motives were established. However, in the end, Julie mentioned one minor detail that made the blood run cold in the veins of experienced police officers. She said that Silva never acted chaotically. Sitting in his cell, she often heard him scribbling monotonously and diligently on paper from just outside the door. He kept daily, meticulous records of every minute of their suffering. And if forensic scientists are able to find these hidden archives, they will be horrified to realize that the basement prison was only an intermediate stage in a much larger and more destructive experiment that this madman planned to take beyond his estate. After the confession of the sole survivor,
investigators returned to the Casaran das Aguas Negras estate for a second, even more thorough search. What they were desperately searching for was found in a former study on the ground floor, behind a securely hidden wooden panel of a massive oak desk. It was 34 thick, black-bound notebooks. The pages were densely scribbled in Hector Silva's small, even handwriting. These diaries turned out to be the most frightening documentary evidence in the history of Brazilian forensics. The former doctor recorded every day of the experiment with frightening scientific meticulousness. He meticulously recorded the victims' respiratory rates, their panic attacks, and the steady process of mental decay. In thousands of pages, there was not a single word of sympathy. For him, 5 living people ceased to be human the moment they crossed the threshold of the basement. They became mere biological material. During the countless hours of interrogation in the pre-trial detention center, Silva behaved in a completely calculating and detached manner. According to the chief investigator, the suspect always sat with his back perfectly straight and spoke in a steady, calm voice.
He never once looked down or showed a drop of remorse. On the contrary, he openly despised the police, calling them limited bureaucrats who rudely interrupted him on the threshold of a great scientific discovery. Silva convincingly claimed that he was one step away from proving his theory that total sensory deprivation can unlock higher functions of the human brain, and that the painful deaths of the 4 Americans were only an unfortunate side effect of their weak genetics. The trial began in the second half of 2018 in the city of Manaus and instantly turned into the most high-profile legal event of the modern decade. The courthouse was tightly surrounded by a triple cordon of armed police, and there was not a single free seat in the spacious courtroom for reporters. Hector Silva sat in the dock in an impeccably pressed suit, watching the proceedings intently, as if he were an honored guest at a medical symposium rather than the main defendant in a serial mass murder case. The defense strategy was quite predictable. The team of the most expensive lawyers tried to prove their client's clinical insanity at any cost. They called independent psychiatrists to the stand, who spent hours telling the jury about complex forms of schizophrenia and a complete loss of contact with reality. The defense's goal was to avoid a life sentence and send Silva to a closed psychiatric hospital. They pompously argued that a person who methodically cuts out eyes in photographs is a priori deeply ill and does not realize the criminality of his cruel actions. However, the chief federal prosecutor was perfectly prepared for this battle. He built the prosecution case solely on the cold logic of physical evidence. When it was his turn to speak, the prosecutor set up a large, lighted stand in front of the jury. One by one, in complete silence, he pinned up all 52 photographs found in the jungle. The prosecutor drew the court's attention to the technique of the crime, showing macro shots of the cut-out eyes on the screen. The edges of the photo paper were perfectly smooth, not the slightest tremor in the hand. This was not the careless work of a chaotic madman. It was the absolutely deliberate, scrupulous work of a professional surgeon. The prosecutor then presented detailed reports on the infrastructure of the underground prison. A modern electronic lock, expensive soundproofing and ventilation systems, secret regular purchases of provisions. All this required precise planning, mathematical calculation, and extreme caution. A person who was completely out of touch with reality would not have been physically able to lead the police by the nose for years, hiding a real concentration camp deep under his house. The most difficult nail in the defense strategy was the 34 diaries found. The prosecutor spent hours reading out the gruesome passages in which Hector Silva described in minute detail how he carefully disguised the traces of the tourists' abduction, and how he cynically planned to dispose of the bodies in an abandoned quarry.
These detailed notes became the final and indisputable proof. The former doctor was well aware that he was breaking the law. He perfectly distinguished the line between good and evil, but he deliberately chose the latter. The official forensic psychiatric examination confirmed the defendant's deep personality disorders and sociopathy, but found him fully sane at the time of the crimes. When the prosecutor finished his devastating speech, he came close to the defendant and looked directly into Hector Silva's eyes. Even then, not a single muscle flinched on the cold monster's face. The judge struck a wooden gavel, announcing a break, and the 12 jurors silently, with pale, tense faces, went to the deliberation room. The courtroom instantly froze in a thick, unbearable expectation. All those present clearly understood that right now, behind tightly closed doors, it was being decided whether justice was capable of recognizing and punishing absolute evil. A large clock on the wall inexorably counted down every minute, bringing closer the inevitable moment when the final word would be spoken, capable of either putting an end to this long-lasting darkness forever or allowing the monster to finally escape real retribution. The thick, unbearable silence in the courtroom of Manaus was broken by the dull thud of a wooden hammer. On May 12, 2019, the federal district judge read the final verdict, which will forever go down in the history of Brazilian forensic science as an act of supreme justice. The reading of the verdict lasted more than 2 hours. According to official transcripts, the judge called the defendant's actions the embodiment of absolute evil, devoid of any signs of human empathy. Hector Silva was found guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, torture, and murder of 4 United States citizens. The former ophthalmologist received the maximum possible sentence of more than 150 years in prison, without the slightest right to early release, appeal, or pardon. When the guards put heavy steel shackles on his wrists to send him to the maximum security federal prison in the state of Mato Grosso, Silva's face never showed any emotion. He headed to his lifelong solitary confinement with the same eerie coldness with which he had watched his victims for years. That same month, the government made an unprecedented decision regarding the crime scene itself. The huge Casarão das Águas Negras estate was completely confiscated. Within weeks, heavy construction equipment was delivered to the isolated peninsula. Powerful bulldozers razed the decaying building to the ground, and engineering crews poured thousands of gallons of concrete into the historic cellars, burying the Red Corridor of Death forever. The local authorities did their best to turn the cursed place into an ordinary wasteland, which was quickly swallowed up by the wild jungle. For the families of the dead tourists, the trial brought a long-awaited conclusion. The remains of Angela Carson, William White, John Ball, and Brian Blake were officially repatriated to the United States. At the end of the summer of 2019, they were buried with proper honors. Their parents finally had a place where they could bring flowers, and years of suspense gave way to quiet grief. But for Julie Gordon, the only person who was able to physically get out of the concrete bag, true liberation never came. In the spring of 2018, she returned to her family in a quiet suburb of Seattle, Washington. Her neighbors saw her only in the first days after her arrival. She was a pale shadow of the cheerful woman who had once gone on vacation. Very quickly, Julie completely withdrew from the outside world. According to her close relatives, the psychological trauma was so deep and devastating that no modern methods of intensive care could bring her back to normal. She bought an isolated house, where her first order of business was to install massive, completely light-tight blinds on every window. Heavy, thick curtains of dark velvet hung over them. The light that she had dreamed of every second during her 7 years of underground imprisonment had now become her worst enemy, a constant and unbearable trigger. Every morning is a fierce battle with her own mind. There are days when a random ray of sunlight, reflected from the window of a neighboring house, somehow miraculously makes its way through a microscopic crack in the window frame and falls on her face.
At moments like this, Julie wakes up to her own heartbreaking scream. Her breath is short, her heart is racing, and her consciousness instantly returns her to the rusty metal chair in the dungeon. Once again, she thinks that the dry click of the camera is about to sound, and the maniac's blinding flash will burn her eyes out. To avoid this pain, she spends most of her life in artificial twilight. The story of this horrific journey leaves a heavy, depressing residue. The last episode of this tragedy unfolds in the living room of her tightly closed house. A cold autumn rainstorm is raging outside. Heavy drops hit the glass monotonously, creating the only sound in the dead silence. Julie sits in a deep armchair, enveloped in a life-saving twilight. Her skinny fingers tightly clutch an old, slightly faded color photograph. It is a picture from October 2010, taken a few hours before their fateful flight.